So, Tyler, what do we know about this agreement?
Well, Matt, at this point, Axios is reporting that this would be a 60-day memorandum of understanding, which does match up with previous reporting that the administration has been pursuing a phased approach where we would see this extension of the ceasefire, and then that would be followed by more formalized discussions around any potential curbs to Iran's nuclear program. Yesterday in the cabinet room, President Trump said that reopening the Strait of Hormuz would be prioritized, which appears to match with this reporting that states that during this 60-day memorandum of understanding, freedom of navigation through the Strait of Hormuz would be, quote, unrestricted, with U.S. officials saying that this means no tolls, no harassment, and that Iran will ultimately have to remove mines that it has laid in that waterway within the first 30 days of the agreement. The reporting goes on to say that the U.S. naval blockade will be lifted. We know that this has been part of these ongoing discussions, but also adds that as part of this, it will include an Iranian commitment not to pursue a nuclear weapon. Just for context here, of course, I'm not totally clear how significant that part of this is, considering that Iran's public negotiating stance has long been that they are not trying to pursue a nuclear weapon, despite Western intelligence assessments to the contrary. Importantly, though, it says that the first issue to be prioritized in these negotiations will be what happens to that stockpile of highly enriched uranium. And Matt, the reporting does end with this, that the U.S. will commit to discuss sanctions relief and the release of Iran's frozen assets. I was in the cabinet room yesterday and asked President Trump what sort of sanctions relief the U.S. would be looking at. I asked him specifically about whether the U.S. would lift sanctions related to Iranian crude, and he told me yesterday that they are not having those discussions until Iran, quote, starts behaving correctly.
Well, maybe this is correct behavior. I mean, Iran has been as you point out, they've always said they won't pursue a nuclear weapon. Whether or not you believe that, as many don't, doesn't change the fact that this is nothing new. They have been asking not only for sanctions relief, but also for reparations, which they can call it reparations, and then we can say, well, it's aid. Is that likely to happen, Tyler?
Well, we're seeing as part of this reporting from Axios that this memorandum of understanding would also include discussion of some sort of mechanisms for Iran to start receiving goods and humanitarian aid. At this point, we haven't gotten formal confirmation from the White House, and we also haven't gotten confirmation from Iran, because you will recall just yesterday, Iranian state media had reported that they received a draft of the memorandum of understanding, and the White House came out and said that's absolutely not true. Some of that reporting does include what we are seeing here today, that the strait would be prioritized to be reopened and the U.S. would lift its naval blockade. But the differences here between the versions is that we know that Iran has been trying to maintain its grip over the Strait of Hormuz. President Trump said yesterday that that's essentially going to be a non-starter, of course, for the U.S. and that no country can have control over the strait. But you're right to bring up this issue of war reparations or payments related to damages, because it just goes to show that there is a long list of sticking points that we still need to see clarity on, including when it comes to Iran's support for proxy militia groups, for example, something that the U.S. has been pushing for to be included in a deal. So perhaps this is some optimism here that there has been diplomatic progress, because just yesterday, President Trump said that he wasn't satisfied yet with how the negotiations were going.
Yesterday in that press conference, President Trump again lambasting the Obama-era agreement, the JCPOA. What can this president get that's better or different than the JCPOA?
It seems that the focus needs to be on what the moratorium on uranium enrichment would ultimately look like. This administration has previously said that it is calling for a permanent moratorium, though, Matt, we know that that would probably be a difficult task to get over the finish line in any sort of a finalized agreement. But I would say that that's really been where a lot of the focus and push has been on in terms of what could come out differently from what we have seen from the prior administration. We also have to talk about what happens to the stockpile of highly enriched uranium after President Trump maintained that the U.S. would like to take it out of the country, dilute it, whereas we're seeing perhaps the idea of a third-party country come into the picture, and that may be something that Iran is a little bit more amenable to. But yesterday he was asked about how he felt about maybe China or Russia taking that stockpile, and he didn't seem to indicate he was too happy with that idea as well.
One of the biggest sticking points on the JCPOA, or the biggest complaints, was that the IAEA inspectors couldn't immediately get into any site they wanted to at the drop of a hat. Is that something we've heard the president mention at all lately? Because it seems that could be a beneficial add from the U.S. side to JCPOA Part 2.
That's a really good point. At this point, though, we haven't really heard that much of a conversation, at least from White House officials, when it comes to what this would ultimately look like, though I'm sure behind the scenes they are discussing some of those more specific details on potential curbs. But so far, the conversation has really been about this phased approach, that you need to prioritize reopening the strait, lifting that naval blockade, and then some of those other things that may come with it, like an unfreezing of at least a portion of Iranian assets. And then we're going to have to get into the idea of what those potential curbs on the nuclear program look like. You even had the U.S. Secretary of State, Marco Rubio, say, look, this is going to take time to hammer out these details that you're floating here right now. But no doubt this is going to be something that the U.S. would probably be interested in, considering that we've repeatedly heard President Trump say that they've been monitoring these sites that he claims were obliterated during the last June's efforts during Operation Midnight Hammer at those nuclear sites. We know that the U.S. has been watching these closely, at least from satellite imagery. So I would expect inspector and the future of what inspections look like would be incorporated into a final deal.